Hi everyone, my name's Meredith McCaig. I'm the convener of academic innovation in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. I want to thank you for coming along this evening and braving the chilly evening. This is an event that's part of the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences regular PsychTalks series. We're putting on tonight's talk in collaboration with National Science Week, and we're being very kindly hosted by the Royal Society of Victoria. Thank you very much, Mike, for having us here. Just being in this building and reflecting on place, it's worth noting that it's a beautiful heritage building, but it's built on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. And whilst this building, I believe, began construction in 1859, a mere 160 years ago, of course, the traditions of the local Wurundjeri people go back millennia. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on Wurundjeri country tonight, to pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and to extend my respects to other Indigenous people who are with us here tonight. We're very privileged to have Uncle Dave Wandin with us here tonight. He's a Wurundjeri elder, and he's here to welcome us to his country. Uncle Dave is the Wurundjeri Land Council's manager of cultural practices, and particularly he manages cultural practices around fire and water. Uncle Dave has led a team of cultural land managers who provide consultation to businesses and commercial enterprises who are working with the land to ensure that they manage that land with respect, is what I assume is the intention. Uncle Dave is a recognised leader both in the promotion and the execution of cultural burns in Victoria. So I'm going to hand over to Uncle Dave to welcome us to country. Thanks.
Thank you for that introduction. Every now and then I get reminded of the things that I have done for my community, and it always surprises me that most of those things you mentioned were just dreams that everybody said was impossible. How are we going to get Indigenous people back managing the land? How are we going to return Indigenous fire to the Victorian landscape? And even my own community said, you're wasting your time. But I've proven them wrong. And we now run a successful business. We're employing, I think we started off with 3 people, we're now employing about 11 young fellas out there on the land now. They're working 5 days a week, and we've got another 5 under training, and it's just growing and growing. The demand for Indigenous knowledge is, well, for our community, it's very hard to keep up with. But it's really important, and I'm proud to be in this day and age where people want to know how to do the right thing, how it was done. So I can talk about the environment quite easily because that is my specialty, but that's not what I'm here for. I'm here to do the welcome, and I can't talk about the cosmos because it is not something that I have in my knowledge bank. I'm quite sure that when I hear a lot tonight, that it will trigger memories that are in me, just the same as when I walk across Wurundjeri country and when I'm showing other people, non-Indigenous people, botanists and ecologists, etc., the way that we look at the landscape and read it and interpret it is totally different to the way that they look at it. But once they look through an Aboriginal's eyes, and I've had a few of them say to me, they said, well, yes, I went to university, and yes, I can name every plant, but geez, I can never look at the bush the same way again. So it's really important. I've always said this, if the early settlers and the colonists had have asked us, why do we do what we do, and tried to understand us, I think this country would be in a much better place, not just for the people in it, but the country itself. But anyway, the official welcome. I don't speak much language either. We leave that to our women. And I won't say we leave it to our women, but they are the ones that have chosen, and I believe they always were the carriers of language and the storytellers. Waminjika, Wurundjeri Biak. Welcome to Wurundjeri country. I also pay my respects to my ancestors and my elders, past and present. I pay my respects to all other Indigenous people that are gathered with us here today, their ancestors and elders past and present, but also their elders emerging. Of course, because we are those young elders, they don't even know they're elders yet. I didn't get told till the last minute there. They're going to have to ask what being an elder meant. And it is, as I found out, it is to make sure to gain as much knowledge as we can, but then to pass it on and make sure that it is not lost forevermore as we thought it was. But I think when you go through this, and I'm thinking about it, I didn't realise I knew what I knew until I just happened to walk with other elders and they pointed out something and I went, yeah, I knew that, but I don't know how I knew that. And I've been telling everybody, I think it's intrinsically in our DNA. There are triggers out there. I can't talk about country. I was talking to someone earlier today. We have a creation story of the Yarra. And I can't actually talk about that creation story unless I'm on the Yarra. Otherwise you won't grasp the concept of what it actually means. Yes, sometimes I get to lecture in these places, but I still prefer to take people out on country and then they walk away with a whole different aspect of things. And when I do look at the stars when I'm out camping at night, I don't look at what you're going to hear tonight, but I know I'll hear something and I'll say, yeah, I already knew that. Because we do have knowledge. It's embedded in the land, it's embedded in the environment, and when you think of space, it's still part of our environment. It still affects how the Earth turns and how we actually live and survive. For those of you who don't know Wurundjeri country, our land extends from the mouth of the Werribee River to the headwaters of the Werribee River. This is rough. Across the which leads us to the Great Dividing Range, across the Great Dividing Range to Mount Borbor, and all the way back down into Port Phillip Bay through the back of Dandenong at Mordialloc Creek. And that Mordialloc Creek story actually connects to the creation of the Yarra, and that's why the creek is the border and not a major river. But that's not a story for here. I only came to do the welcome. I'm glad that I'm going to stay. I hope you don't ask me too many questions because I know we have an expert panel here. We're experts in their field. They may not be the experts yet. We still all have a lot to learn. But all I can say is the only way that we are going to move forward for the future of this world is with modern science, but it'll be a combination of ancient knowledge, not just of Aboriginal people, but Indigenous peoples from all around the world. Wherever you go, those people do have knowledge that is physically and spiritually and psychologically entrenched in their lands, in their minds and in their hearts. And we should never forget that as we move forward. Waminjika, Wurundjeri, Biak. Welcome to Wurundjeri country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uncle Dave, for that welcome. And I think, although you said you don't know much about the stars, you hit the nail right on the head in terms of what we're talking about tonight, which is the way in which the stories in the stars link to the land and how those things go together. So I think, you pretty much summed up the topic for tonight really beautifully.
That's all I had.
Yeah. Good on you. That's great. Okay, so I don't want to take up too much of our time because I really want to get to hear what our speakers have to say. You're in for a real treat tonight. We've got 4 very diverse experts in their fields, as has been pointed out, tonight to help us understand the way in which the star stories of Indigenous peoples across the world, but with a particular focus tonight, at least starting with the Indigenous Australians, how these stories embed knowledge that relates to the land and have allowed knowledge to be passed down over millennia through oral traditions, song and dance. Okay, so we really are looking at the interconnectedness of all things, from the stars to the land and through to bodies and culture and song and dance. We're going to think about what it is about humans and the way they perceive their environment that causes them to find stories in the stars and to make stories, and how those stories serve as a kind of structure that helps embed memory. Okay? So this link between this amorphous thing that we call memory and the physicalising of it in the landscape is a powerful way for passing down knowledge, separate from the text-based culture that we are so embedded in today. So we're really looking at another way of knowing and asking ourselves what it is that we can learn about this way of knowing and how it might it might help us. We're going to explore some of the fascinating similarities between the star stories of different cultures, and we're going to reflect on how these stories can help us think about things like education, our own well-being, and the way that we age. Okay, so that's just a little snippet of where we're going. It's a terrible pun, and you'll get it later, but I'm looking forward to what I expect to be a scintillating conversation, and I'm going to introduce our speakers now. Okay, so starting with a proud Wotjobaluk woman from the Wimmera in Victoria, Kat Clark. Is here. Kat's a writer, consultant and artist. She's passionate about sharing her knowledge and passing down her Wotjobaluk culture to others and sharing it. And it's great to welcome Kat here tonight. We've got Dr. Simon Cropper. He's a colleague of mine in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences. He's a neuroscientist and educator. Simon is, I think, a unique educator. He brings art and science together in the most extraordinary way, and he gets our students to think about the connections between art and science. And in particular, his specialty is perception, and tonight he's bringing to us his knowledge of the way that we perceive meaning in patterns. So welcome to Simon. Next to Simon, we have Dr. Lynn Kelly. Lynn is an academic from Latrobe University, and she's the writer of very well-known books. You may be familiar with The Memory Code, and most recently she's released her latest book, Memory Craft. Lynn has explored the fascinating thesis that Paleolithic cultures built their stone structures, so structures like Stonehenge and the structures we see at Easter Island, to embed their knowledge systems in physical structures. Once they started to settle and not roam the landscape so much, the songlines that had been navigated became embedded in place in these stone structures. And it leads to her whole theme about the way in which memory is embedded in landscape. So Lynn's here to share her knowledge of that with us tonight. And last but not least, Associate Professor Dwayne Hammaker. He is an archaeoastronomer. I wish I was one of those. Archaeoastronomer. That is just the coolest title, I reckon. He's an expert in cultural and Indigenous astronomical knowledges and traditions, and he's also from the University of Melbourne, most recently in the School of Physics. And Dwayne has a deep knowledge of the way in which the Indigenous cultures of Australia, but also of other areas, use the stars to encode knowledge, to navigate, etc. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to get going with the discussion. Can I just remind people first just to turn off their mobile phones? We are recording tonight. We're using a hashtag at PsychTalks for those who want to use that text-based message of communication. Okay, so I'm going to start off tonight handing over to Kat. Kat is from the Wimmera region in Victoria, and she has star stories that've been passed down to her. And I thought it'd be a nice way to start, to get Kat to talk to us about the stories that have been passed down to her, and just giving us a feel for how knowledge is encoded in these stories.
Yeah, sure. I'd first like to pay my respects to Uncle for giving that beautiful welcome to country, to all other Indigenous, Torres Strait Islander, First Nations, Aboriginal people in the room currently, as well as acknowledge my own ancestors and, I guess future generations coming forward. I can't talk for myself so much because I still think I'm in between being in my 30s, so I'm sort of not a child and I'm sort of nowhere near an elder status at the moment, so I'm still a learner, and I see myself as an apprentice who sits and really just listens. My elders taught me that if we're not really listening, then we're not really seeing. And I live by that and that law. that they had passed on. But within saying that, I pay my respects and I listen to you, Uncle, and I appreciate what you share in this room, because it is very much important to what we learn and what we understand for our future generations to walk forward. And I think it's important too for other people to understand in order for us to all walk together. So I'd like to acknowledge you and acknowledge your elders and ancestors, aunties, uncles, brothers, sisters, and your kin as well. And I'd like to also acknowledge everyone in this room today. Thank you for having me. So yes, I am a Watchabalik woman. I'm from the Wimmera. I'm a Clark, I'm a Harrison. On either side, it is very important to know who your family names are when it comes to family, and growing up as a blackfella kid, it's really important. And that was a lot of my upbringing as a child, was sitting between growing up in Ballarat, but travelling between Ballarat and Horsham, Dimboola, and we go up to the river there, or we go up to the ranch up home, and we'd learn and we'd sit with the elders there, and we'd have, yarns, and they'd just be yarns. There wouldn't actually be anything in them that would have a reason of why they were being told. They were being told because we were there in that moment, and we were that generation that was growing up, and what we learn is what we take on board in that time and in that moment. And I always am thankful, because I look back, when I go back home today, one of the things I'm always thankful for are those stories, because those stories, to me, they never change. And I've brought with me today our creation story, which is a story, I don't know if I can move around and talk. I'm going to get up. I've brought with me, thank you. I've brought with me my father's artwork. It's called Watchabalik Dreaming. It was painted back in '98. I'm sorry for the art, sorry for the guys. We'll quickly turn this around.
Yeah, we want to see it. Never mind them, we want to see it.
So that's the artwork. This artwork is, done by my father, Thomas Fleetwood Clark. He is an artist, he is a Watchabalik man, but he's also an A-grade electrician who worked in mainstream all his life, never identified in an identified role, sorry. Always identified. Sorry. So what we see in this story are two stories in one. Thank you, Simon. I'd like to stand in front of that. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So basically what I would like to explain in this story is the fact that there are two stories in one, and very much relevant to what we're talking about in terms of songlines, and when we look at the way our memory knowledge is passed down. I look at this artwork, and this is a form of that story being passed down, but also the agency of who tells those stories. In our role, we have in our culture, and in our communities, we all have a role to play. We all have significant reasons of what that role is, but we also, at the same time, are given that by our elders and by our community members. So no story or no actual cultural practice, certain things like that aren't done without having the agency and the knowledge of those elders and those people who came before us to share that with us and pass that on to us. And this is what this story is talking about. Around the campfire, you have your storyteller, and there you have your apprentices, who are the listeners, they're your community members, but they're sitting around that fire, and what he talks about is what's in the stars, our creation story. The Watchabalik creation story is of the giant emu, Chingle. Chingle was a giant emu before, way, way, way long ago. She was someone who terrorised our people. She was born out at Mount Emu, so off Watchabalik country, down near Jabberong, Watherong country, in between those areas. And that's where her nest is. And the story actually talks about how our river, our mountains were created. And it was during this time that Bunjil was creating our area. After he had finished creating the lands of the Kulin and down around here, he ended up coming up near our area. and ended up in the Grampians. And with that, he had Wah with him. And one day, Wah was out because he had heard about the giant emu terrorising, but they couldn't find where the actual nest was. As they were searching for the nest, he seen something shine, really glow like a diamond in the distance. And he realised that that was actually Chingle's eye. And so he flew back and went all the way back to the Watchbullet people. News of that the nest had been found, spread across the lands. Now this went up to Central Desert. If we hear of the Lightning Bolt brothers, there's 3 of them. The story of those Lightning Bolt brothers carried on down into Watchbullet country. And what happened with the Lightning Bolt brothers is one of those brothers come down because he thought he could get Chingle, he could kill Chingle. So he went there and he found her nest with Wah. And what happened was the fact that she killed him. She found him, she killed him. Today he's one of the jagged rocks that sit around her nest. Hearing of their brother's disappearance, the Bram Bolt brothers, Lightning Bolt brothers, came down looking for him, and they met with the Watchbullet people, and they sat with us and they heard of Chingle, and they were wondering why wasn't anyone able to stop this beast? Where was their brother? They ended up going and they searched. Now Wah led them there to where Chingle was hiding in her nest, and this time though, Chingle had actually seen them and had actually been prepared for them to come. And so as they were sneaking up and approaching her, she sprung on them and a chase began. And throughout that chase, so too began the journey of what the Grampians is today. So every cut, every fall that Chingle had made, everywhere Wah and his trickeries went throughout those coves is where Chingle had ran chasing Wah. But the Bram Bolt brothers had an idea, and we go up near Mount Arapiles there and we would capture her. And out near there, basically they got her in a crevice and she was speared once in the neck by one Bram Bolt brother, speared in the butt, or the mum, what we say, as well. And there she basically, passed on. In doing that, her blood became the Wimmera River, In celebration, Wah took the wattlebird, Bambimble, back to the nest of the emu and picked up the giant egg, and they took that back to Horsham where they cracked it. A bit of that egg yolk that cracked went onto the wattlebird, onto Bambimble, which is why the wattlebird has the yellow today. But in doing that too, Bunjil came down and he sat with the Bram Bolt brothers and he had made them the lawmen then of our country. So they were the ones that were the countrymen who guarded our areas then, and said what went in that country. They became our lawmen. And within that, Bunjil sent Chingle into the sky and they trapped her with the Bram Bolt brothers. They trapped her into the Southern Cross, which is what we look at the Southern Cross today. Inside there is Chingle, imprisoned forever, her spirit. On the other side, you have the 2 further stars watching over the Southern Cross. We know them to be the Bram Bolt brothers. And then on the other side of the Southern Cross, down on this side is where Wah sits. And the story basically talks about that path line too. So when you look at the Grampians and the path line, the Grampians is a line, which is pretty much your line of your Southern Cross going straight down. And the significant sacred areas as well that those stars and that Southern Cross represent that are significant to my country back home and are seen as sacred places back up there in Garryware, which we hear about, where we know there are lots of rock art. You've got Bunjil's Cave up there. All of those places are significant, but they're marked through reading that story and understanding our dreaming story. How I said it tonight was totally different. So I tell it the way I just interpret it, the way I can. I can never tell it the best, but my Auntie Vicky cousins and, a lot of the other aunties and uncles that used to work at the Trust at King Street when I was there. They shared a lot with me, and I was there during the time they were making this book, which is Mirroring Anne, which is my country, and that story is actually in that book, and it's the story of Aboriginal Victoria, through the artwork. But this is our artwork. This is my songline, and is a great way to start, I guess, tonight in talking about how we map it out and how those stories continue, because this is a creation story that's been continuing on for many generations, and it hasn't changed at all since my upbringing. So, yeah, I'm fascinated to hear what the science is and everything around that and the psychology behind all of this. So I'm really excited to hear from our other people, our other guests that we have speakers. And, yeah, thank you for letting me share this.
Thanks so much, Kat. It's such a wonderful way to start and to share that knowledge that has been passed down over millennia with us tonight is just so special. And it's brought up so many of the themes that we want to pick up on tonight. So you're mentioning the Southern Cross and the dark emu within the Southern Cross that is carried across so many of the Australian Indigenous stories and is shared. So it's fascinating to see those connections coming through. And of course the dark emu that Bruce Pascoe refers to is referenced there in your story definitely. Of Chingal, yeah?
Yes.
So this seems like a really nice segue to me to Dwayne, who's our archaeoastronomer, to tell us from a Western perspective, a Western science perspective, how the stories in the stars map to the Earth, which is really what you were saying, that stars, you're using the stars as a way of understanding what's on the Earth.
Basically, I was saying to go back to really what I was saying, when it comes to stories, our stories are shared through generation to generation. And the way our community work is the children are at the centre. If you look at it as a ring, and a multiple rings, children are at the centre. You've got your kids, your parents and all of that. Then you've got your extended family, and then you've got your further extended family, and then you've got the community. And all of that is to raise that child. But without the elders or without that child, then that knowledge disappears. And it's important that we look out for our elders and we respect our elders and that knowledge that they have to share, because without them, who are we going to learn that knowledge from? You're not born with this knowledge. The other thing that I think is really important is that we look after our young. Separate aside, youth, there's youth suicide and all of that sort of stuff happening, but the importance of looking after our youth is very vital for our community, because they're the next generations, and if our elders don't have those youth there to teach and educate, and our young don't have those elders there, then those stories get lost. And unfortunately, I'm someone who lost my grandparents at a very young age, so I had to look for other elders to find those stories and connect a lot of it. And I'm still doing that, My mum's always saying too, culture is an ongoing learning thing. You never know enough about culture. Education is the same. And it's the agency, though, that you go and you take with that. I don't have the agency to go and, talk about certain music or song or dance, but there's certain agencies there that I've been given because I'm a writer, and that I've also proven to show through my humbleness sitting with the elders, and what I've learnt sitting with the elders, basically, they've given me that permission. And so nothing is done without acknowledging that first, and those stories, and then understanding that when those stories are passed through and passed down, of not only acknowledging that they're from the past, but also understanding how you can interpret them within today's society, and are they still the same? And when I look at those stars today, they haven't changed in the millions of years that my ancestors have been looking at them. And, same when it comes to waterways. Our waterways may have changed, but the way that the water actually flows doesn't. And that water will always flow there, regardless, no matter where it changes. It will return back to where it's supposed to be. And that's the understanding of what's important as a caretaker of the land, because we don't own the land either. So as caretakers of the land, and what we take on is understanding both those sky and understanding the land in order to walk holistically on both, because we say we work in two worlds too. So in order to be connected to what's in the natural and physical, to what's in the spiritual and other plane that, you know, that we walk between. And yeah, it's those stories that help us stay connected and keep us remembering, and those.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no.
So Dwayne, tell us a little bit from an archaeoastronomer's perspective about star stories and their role in Indigenous cultures and preserving knowledge from your perspective.
Sure. And thanks, Uncle, for the welcome and acknowledging that I am on traditional land and paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I've been very lucky for the last about 11 years to learn a lot from Aboriginal and especially Torres Strait Islander people across the country. And I've been very privileged to be able to learn a lot about that and bring these two worlds together. I mean, I'm a white American guy. What do I really know about this sort of stuff, you know? But I've been very, very lucky to have learned a bit about that. And one thing that I've been excited about is being able to learn about the cultural interface of Indigenous knowledge of Western science with the eyes of an astronomer. Because when I first came to Australia and started learning about this stuff, I was studying astrophysics. I wasn't doing Indigenous astronomy. But when I started asking people about Aboriginal views of the sky, the comments I got were generally very negative, and just this general impression like, oh, they're just some myths and legends and stories. There's nothing really important there. But when I read the stories, I could see all the layers of science behind it. And I was really perplexed. How is nobody recognizing this? Why is nobody it's right here. What are you talking about? And then I learned a little bit about the intentional sort of cultural blindness that happens where people don't want to see that sort of thing. So it's been sort of my mission for the last decade to try to bring this stuff out to the forefront, and by working with the elders and the communities to show that at the base level, trying to understand the world around us is science. It's doing it through observation, through deduction, and has predictive purposes. It's about developing knowledge systems to figure out how the world around us works. That is science at its root. It's different the way Western science does things versus Indigenous science, and you talked about, you elaborated quite well on that. Western science, we try to separate culture. We don't do a very good job of it, despite what my colleagues think we do. And we try to find universal truths, whereas what I've always learned from the elders is that the knowledge is in situ. It's within that specific location. So listening to you talk about these stories tonight's been really fantastic, because I can see some of the layers of science behind that. And it's like a big Venn diagram, and what I'm really looking at is a crossroads between Indigenous science and Western science. That story, I've learned about the emu in the sky, the dark emu. In fact, I was out on country yesterday with Uncle Bruce Pascoe. They're turning dark emu into a film, which is really great. And we were looking at some stuff out there and how the dark emu itself is found all across Australia. The stories about the emu itself and how it gets into the sky, those vary from community to community, of course. But the base knowledge of what it tells you is very similar, because everything on the land is reflected in the sky. That's one of the things the elders have told me over the years. And they've also taught me that if you know how to read the stars, you know how to predict anything and everything you need to know. And when they say read the stars, what they mean is how to observe the changing positions and properties of the stars, how to see all the knowledge encoded in the stars, and how to interpret that. So even though the stories of the emu may be different across the country, what it tells you at the base is still the same. When stars rise and set at dusk and dawn, those are the critical times. Those are the important times you really want to look for these things. When the emu in the sky rises at sunset, that's the time of the year the emus are laying their eggs. It's the emu breeding season. The Gomeroi and Uwalya people talk about it being a female emu, and she's running because she's chasing a mate. It's the females who chase the males. They mate. She lays the clutch of eggs, and then she goes off while the male sits on the eggs and incubates them. That takes about 2 months, about 58 to 59 days. And the position of the emu as the year progresses changes from rising at sunset to being across the horizon at sunset, across the sky. That's when the males are sitting on the nest. As it loops around, it becomes perpendicular to the horizon. It's the males getting up off of the nests, and the chicks are hatching. So it tells you about the changing seasons. It tells you about the behavior of the emu. And there's some really great science behind that. One of the Aboriginal astrophysics students working with us, Kirsten Banks, did a really great TEDx talk in Sydney a few months back. And she talked about the emu in the sky and the hunting practices. And one of the neat things about the science behind that is whenever we talk about the emu, it's the female who chases the male. Everybody's like, oh, well, that's unusual. Why is that? How many people have seen an emu egg before? How big are they? They're freaking huge, right? How much energy does it take that emu to produce and lay that clutch of eggs? It's a huge expenditure of energy. You cannot expend that. I'm thinking this purely in biophysics terms. You cannot produce and expend that kind of energy and then sit and incubate the eggs for 2 months and not get up. She's got to go back and feed. She's got to go back and take care of herself. It's the males that fatten up. It's the males that sit on the nest, and it's the males that rear the young. So there's a great bit of science behind that because it tells you about the changing seasons, but also this is a constellation that's not made up of the bright stars. It's a constellation made up of the dust lanes in the Milky Way. It's a dark sky constellation. And what's fascinating about these dark sky constellations is you find them around the world. Southern hemisphere mostly, or very southerly northern hemisphere cultures. If you go to the Tupi people in Brazil, they see the exact same shape as a rhea. It's a large flightless bird just like an emu. And because the emu and the rhea are basically the same kind of bird, same family, they have very similar breeding patterns, very similar behavior patterns. And even though the story about how the emu gets in the sky might be different, the base information about how that works is nearly identical. So you find these commonalities between cultures and traditions around the world relating to those elements. It's quite fascinating.
It is fascinating, and I'm looking to Simon now to tell us a little bit about what it is about that is common, despite different cultures, different stories. What is it about human brains and human perceptual systems that allow us to see patterns in stars? And even, fascinatingly, with the dark emu, of course, it's the space between the stars that we see the shape, yeah? If we look in the right way. Simon, enlighten us.
I'll try. Thank you, Uncle Dave, for the welcome, and thank you, Kat, for being part of this. And I too recognise that we're on traditional land and pay my respects to elders past, present and future, and everyone, actually. What you asked is a huge question. I feel the least qualified to be here. I'm here because I'm really interested in this stuff. And my initial interest came from coming out, the first time I came out to Australia from the UK. One of the things, and it's quite a common observation, that people from the Northern Hemisphere notice when they come to somewhere like Australia is how much bigger the sky is at night. It's huge. In the Northern Hemisphere, we get this tiny little sort of restricted view of it in most places, particularly in the UK, where it's this kind of little crowded, built-up place. And I remember out, not that far from Melbourne, but certainly far enough to not have any city haze, lying on my back, looking at the sky, being completely awestruck by it, because it was like I'd never seen this before in this form, and finding things which were kind of familiar, but not quite. As in, it wasn't that I didn't have a huge knowledge of the stars or astronomy at all, but I knew some things. I knew that there's this thing in the UK called the Plow, and we sort of recognised it and stuff. And I was thinking, that looks exactly like it, but it's upside down. And even though logically I knew it was going to be upside down, it was it was hard to get my head around. And I remember later on the same visit, I was lying on a cliff down on the Great Ocean Road with my head hanging over the cliff trying to get it to turn the right way up, which didn't work terribly well. But it was that, and I remember that from a long time ago and more recently, and I think it was a conversation I had with Dan Little, who also is working with us on this. It was about that. Why is it that we put these things together? Why is it that I recognise the Plow? And I recognised it when it was upside down in a much busier sky when I was down here. And then started to think about, well, why is it that across cultures that are thousands of years and thousands of miles apart are these similarities? What is it about that natural structure of the sky that causes us to group these things together and say, well, that's what that is? And until it's pointed out to you, certainly you don't look at the sky, oh, look, there's a plow and a bull and a crab and all of these things. They're not like they're configurable pictorial representations. They're just tiny little points which together are sufficient for someone to develop a hugely complex narrative about, which then facilitates that particular configuration being passed on through generations and between people, which then helps them in their life and their connection with the land. And then one of the things that's sort of in this the sort of conversation that started that's really struck me is how much we rely on the night sky to ground us, because we find it so easy to change the structure of the land around us, both positively and negatively, and we're doing all sorts of terrible things to it. But it's a lot harder to do that to the night sky. And I think we inadvertently rely on the night sky not being so changeable in order to give us a sense of security in the context of what we're doing here, which is not a very secure place in many, many ways. And we rely on those narratives that we produce about them, whether they be relatively simple things and names or far more complex representations of how we like to develop a narrative of our life, which we do constantly, and then place it and link it directly to our environment, so we have a more continuous relationship between what's going on inside our heads, which is just another natural structure, and what's going on out there. And so that we feel like we have, I think if we do that, then we end up with more of a connection to where we are, because we're sort of creating that narrative in a similar form to both the natural structure outside and the natural structure inside our head, which is just, after all, a whole lot more natural things called neurons that communicate with each other in a particularly natural way, as it happens, in terms of the structure of that activity. Why people do bunch things together is something that we're actually really interested in finding out. It's not something that seems to have an awful lot of work about it. And it's sort of, my sense is that it's because we love pattern and we love meaning and we love making sense of stuff, but there's a point at which we've got to start to, in a sense, almost externalize it. And in the stars, if we were trying to categorize the stars and describe the night sky, it would be impossible without a narrative that was not about, there's this star here, there's that star there, there's this star there, because there are too many. And so we make another, in a sense, sort of description that we can pass on, however it forms, whether it's simple names or whether it's a story. And that gives us something to hold on to and something, in a sense, inside our heads to provide, a place to put it. And it's easier to remember a story in the same way as it's easier to remember a song lyric than it is to just remember a series of words. And it also can be communicated between people far more effectively, particularly to young people, as you were saying, to kids, and then them to understand that link to the world and sort of maintain that cycle of it.
Yeah. And that's a really lovely segue from perception into memory, which is Lynn's domain, and the idea that narrative and story is central to the way that we remember, and externalising those stories into the landscape gives us cues to assist memory. So this back and forth between what's in the head and what's in the environment, I'll let you speak to that, Lynn. Yeah.
Yes, I came at this from a very different perspective. I have a naturally exceedingly bad memory. I was good at maths and nothing else. And I was working on animal stories as a writer and looking at whether Indigenous stories would help me see more in the behaviour of animals. And that was going to be a PhD and going to be a book, except I started realising that Indigenous people were memorising vast amounts of information, not just the big mammals, but all of the insects as well. 1,000 animals, 1,000 plants. From the Yanua, we know 800 kilometres of country all mapped. Incredible relationships, which are too complicated for me to work out. All this stuff, and my question became, how the hell are they doing it? And that derailed my PhD, derailed my book, and became my new topic of a PhD in 3 books. And so that's where I came to country and the perception and the way the brain works, I first asked Aboriginal people, how the hell are you doing this? And discovered that the landscape, as you're talking about moving through it, and sacred places, at the sacred places, rituals are performed. Now, rituals are repeated events. You can't interpret them any more than that. And repetition makes things memorable. Song is much more memorable. And you've probably seen research of people well into dementia that play familiar songs and they'll react or take to a familiar place. Song and place are embedded really, really deeply in memory. And Indigenous cultures sing knowledge right through, and they associate with place. So then if you look at the way songlines work, you go from location to location to location, and each location works as a trigger for a performance, because any information sung, danced, and story is more memorable, and so on. And then I started reading about the ancient Greeks who had memory palaces where they would move from location to location. So if Cicero was sitting here doing this great long waffle for hours and hours, in his mind he would be walking through a building or a landscape, and at each location he'd pull back the next bit of his speech. And that was invented by the Greeks, I kept reading everywhere. It was not invented by the Greeks. Aboriginal songlines, Native American pilgrimage trails, Pacific Islands, ceremonial roads, they're all the same thing, because it's the way the brain is structured and perceives and best memorises. So we ought not be learning about Indigenous cultures, and may I acknowledge Uncle Dave, and thank you, and Kat, but also the Judge of Warring, whose country I live on, and who have asked me to use the term teachings, because stories and song and dance are teachings. It's how they learn. And so you've got the stars, which act as a set of locations. Moving, too hard for me, I can manage the landscape. But you've got those reflected in the landscape, as a lot of Dwayne's work shows. But they also use physical devices, handheld devices as memory devices. This is an Aboriginal Coolamon from a food dish from Central Desert that I've been granted custodianship of. And those markings on the back are used as a memory aid. Now I'll go over to an African one that works the same, because there's all sorts of restricted knowledge. Restricted knowledge is because if it's talked about too much, it becomes corrupted, and you end up with the Chinese whispers effect. We have stories in Australia that date back 10,000 years accurately on landscape changes and astronomical changes. I'm hoping to shove back to Dwayne without warning you to give an example. But in Africa, similar, we've got the same brain right round. They have a device called Lukasa. There's no elders left that can still use it, but it's the same sort of effect. It looks a bit like that. And according to research, they have encoded masses of information to it, like the Aboriginal Chiringa. And I thought, rubbish. I'm a foundation member of the Australian Skeptics. I'm a hardcore scientist. I'm not going to believe this sort of stuff. So I grabbed a bit of wood, shoved on some beads and shells, and started encoding a field guide to the Victorian birds. If I've got long enough, I could reel off 412 birds in taxonomic order and all their family names from that bit of wood, and I don't even need it with me. That it just is astounding. So I'm not going to go on and on, except to say that I've been meeting with curriculum people, and part of our Victorian curriculum is that we should be learning about Indigenous cultures. Can we change that wording, please, to from Indigenous cultures? Because their memory techniques are sensational. And if Dwayne can throw in the example.
Examples of memory lasting a very long time. We've got some shorter term ones. There are traditions about Mount Gambier erupting, and the Henbury meteorite falls. Those go back about 4,500 years. Yeah. There's examples of the sea level rise all around the country that go back about 7,000 to 8,000 years. But we get some more interesting stuff. We go back, I'm actually about to submit a paper in the next couple of weeks about a Tasmanian Aboriginal tradition that talks about Moaney and Dromardine, Moaney being the Great South Star. And at the time, that Dromardine and Moaney were created by the Sun Man and the Moon Woman in the Tasmanian Palawa traditions. Tasmania wasn't an island. It was connected to the mainland, and that their ancestors had come from Victoria down to Tasmania from the mainland. The last time Tasmania was connected to the mainland was 13,000 years ago. Incidentally enough, the stars do change very slowly over time because of precession of the equinoxes. What that means is where the south celestial pole and the north celestial pole are pointed relative to the background stars does a big loop every 26,000 years. If you go back to 13,000 years ago, Moani, the Great South Star, which the anthropologists incorrectly identified as, well, they didn't know what it was, it's the star Canopus. And when you go back 13,000 years ago, Canopus was only about 9 degrees away from the south celestial pole. So the second brightest star in the night sky was about as far away from the south celestial pole as your fist is at arm length. So it's just sitting there in the sky doing a little loop. And that's what all the traditions talk about. Geological evidence and astronomical evidence showing an old tradition going back 13,000 years, that's not even the oldest ones. There are traditions of volcanic eruptions going back 14 to 17,000 years ago in northern Queensland. And of course, there's lots of Aboriginal traditions that talk about the megafauna, which I think archaeologists are saying in Victoria went out about 30,000 years ago. And of course, there are traditions across the country where people say our ancestors came from far away in the north. That's going back 65,000 years or more. So there's lots of ways that you can look at the longevity of oral tradition, bringing together Indigenous and scientific perspectives, Indigenous science and Western scientific perspectives. And when you can bring together geological and astronomical evidence together, that's pretty awesome.
And so if we can put that into context, Stonehenge, which I wrote about at one stage, is 5,000 years ago. It's a mere baby compared to our traditions. So what happened when I went to Stonehenge, when my head was full of this stuff? I just went there because my husband trained as an archaeologist. I had no interest in it. And I started saying, it was originally a circle of 60 stones in what's called the Aubrey Holes. I could waffle on forever about this. And all I thought to myself was, right, that's clear enough. Instead of mobile, not nomadic, our cultures haven't been nomadic for ever and a day, but know the country and move between resources. As they start to farm, they have to localise. And I thought, terrific. What they've done is made a memory palace, moved those sacred locations and represented them locally so they don't lose the information. And then originally those great big guys in the middle weren't there, and then they've moved it in and made it more secretive and opened up another one up the road for more public, so you've got the public restricted. And then I said, well, hang on, Aboriginal people, I just took everything I was taught by Aboriginal people, have handheld devices. Stonehenge, there's carved chalk stone balls are up further, but chalk plaques that are carved, and they're called enigmatic ritual objects by the archaeologists. There's carved stone balls from Scotland from the Neolithic as well. I showed a picture to an Aboriginal elder here and he said, they've done their chiringa as balls, isn't that interesting? Now let me tell you he had just solved one of the world's great mysteries. But no Neolithic archaeologist in England had come here and asked our elders, what might this be used for? And they should have.
Yep.
I can go on forever.
Yep. You could.
We've all got that talent.
Yeah, so the idea that you can use place, whether it's something as large as Stonehenge or something as simple as a ball that could be held in the hand with markings on it, that externalises memory and serves as a mnemonic to call to mind the knowledge. That's really what you're talking about.
And once you try it, we've been doing this in experiments, educators know, with 3-year-olds, making devices like this and encoding it, and cannot believe how effective it is. Until you try linking to the stars or easier the landscape or a device like this, you cannot understand. We have to bring this back into education, and I'm only at the simple level. I will shut up eventually. With the landscape, what Indigenous cultures do that I think we have lost from our education system is that they base a basic structure which the kids are taught, which just gives you the basic foundation, and then they layer and layer and layer philosophy and it's all integrated. but they lay down this really solid foundation first.
Yeah. And this picks up something, Kat, that you and I were talking about when we were first talking about this event, of the different levels of knowledge. What starts off as a children's story comes to gain more and more sophistication and knowledge. Can you speak a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. I always look at it, you know, in a way of saying, it was said to me some years back that, you know, when they say truth becomes fact becomes, you know, legend becomes history, or whatever, history becomes myth, legend becomes myth, or something like that. I've always thought there's very much a lot of truth to that, and I always go back to when I was a kid and I had someone sort of say to me, your creation, your God can't be an animal, because, you know, how can you have an animal as a God? And, you know, my idea was, you know, how can you question my God when, you know, I haven't even know what yours looks like. Yours has no idea what it looks like, you know. So, and that was just something that I had done as a kid, you know, and had learnt. But I guess to go back to what you're really talking about is that idea that, you know, that passing on is. Sorry, what was the question again? Well, I got caught up in the.
I was bouncing off Lynn's idea that you can start with a simple narrative structure, but it will build more layers. And more layers,
definitely.
Of knowledge that grow as you grow and gain different levels of significance. Yeah,
totally. And everything, like, we look at things in threes, you know, and that things can't sort of be done without, you know, having those sort of things put on you from those ages. Like, I guess I'll start again. Basically, where I'm coming from is more or less the idea that, you know, as a child you're learning these things, and then as you get older, you know, we're interpreting them in different ways, and those stories never change, but they're, you know, the way we interpret them do. And the things that come out of that is coming back to the idea that, you know, it's a constant form of what you guys are talking about with the memory, you know. And I feel like learning from you guys tonight, that very much is my childhood. Like, I feel like, you know, I went from a young age learning these things, and they were through song, they were through sitting and listening to stories and things like that, you know, hearing about little things that taught you morals. You know, we got the Nutcher, who's the little hairy man with the red eyes, you know, and he kidnaps you if you're naughty and you wander away from the tribe, and that's why you go in twos, you know. It also those stories also map out certain seasons. We have 6 seasons, you know, and we read them from the skies to the land to what's there, and that's how we know when to harvest. That's how we know when to do those sort of things. And all of those sort of layers then come up to create this holistic thing, which is where, I mean, I don't like to call it a blackfellow spirituality or anything, you know. It's our ethos. It's something that's, you know, is integral to who we are as our identity, and it makes up every bit of it. So all of that learning and all of that storytelling, all of that passing on becomes a part of what my identity is and how I see my connection to that land, to that country, but also to my kinship structures, you know, and also to the way that the law is. We have Bunjil's law, you know, here in Victoria, and all of the mobs that know, who are connected, who have Bunjil as the creator spirit, know Bunjil's law. And those are, you know, respect each other, look after our young, you know, look after and take care of the land and take care of our waterways and all of that sort of stuff. So these are those laws that we live from, but they're all stories that are connected and interpret and communicate to each other from the sky to the land.
So what starts as a simple story turns into deep knowledge about essentially science, is what Dwayne's saying as well.
Straight to science. But to me, it's a life thing. To me, it's not science. To me, it's a life thing.
Yeah, and there's always, all those science stories also have an ethical and moral level. But what Nungarai Woolpiri woman that gave me custodianship of that said to me, if I could possibly get across, and if you listen to everything that Uncle Dave and Kat have been saying, it's all practical. And yet Indigenous cultures are so often represented as if they live in this sort of superstitious world and we're the practical ones. And she said, the elders were pragmatic old buggers. We wouldn't have survived if they weren't. And I think that's really, everything you're saying is so practical, but ethics and morals are practical too, along with science.
So the stories, which seem so fantastical, this is something you would speak to, Lynn. It's the fantasticalness of the stories that makes them memorable. Yes. So although there's a deeper, much more practical knowledge here, on the surface this sounds like a bizarre story. But what it does is it gives you this highly memorable and emotive story to capture that knowledge in a very memorable way. Yeah.
Exactly. Anything, especially if there's violence or sex in it, it's much more memorable. And Simon might like to talk about perception. I'm Australia's senior memory champion, and we do decks of cards and numbers, and what we do is give them character and then make little stories on the run with them, because the brain likes stories, it likes wildness, it likes vivid characters. That's what makes it memorable. Can I hand over to you at that point, or have I just landed you in?
To take over on sex and violence?
Sex and violence. Perception, sex and violence.
I think the description of Kat, of both of you, is that it's a far more visceral connection to everything in your life, whether it be something that we might define as spiritual, physical, or practical, or whatever. And there's a greater consistency between the whole thing, rather than trying to portion it off into that's work, or this is play, or this whatever it is. And I think we're much better if we're interconnected and everything is far more consistent and related to one another than when we try and portion it off, even though we constantly try and portion it off and pretend we're okay with that, and pretend we're okay being one person in one situation and one person in another situation. Well, we're not actually okay with that. We're much better when there is that consistency and we recognise the connectedness between people and history and culture and what you're eating now and what you're going to plant and the pets you might have and all of these other things. And I mean, it's sort of tangentially related is one of the other psych talks we have is about online stuff, and it just separates people even further. And you mentioned this when you came in, Uncle Dave, about oral traditions can't be transmitted on a computer. But unfortunately, to maintain some of the characteristics and information about the oral tradition, it's got to be on a computer, which is this remarkably undurable virtual thing, which could be destroyed in an instant, actually, unlike an oral tradition.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that one thing that really strikes me, and in a similar sort of way as the sky being so related to the ground and to everything else, is how connected that approach is, and how, in a sense, much more grounded, for want of a better term, that we are when we take that approach. And I think we all have our own little ways of doing it, but we're kind of quite restricted in that. And maybe we should think about looking to Indigenous culture and Indigenous narrative and that approach to learn a bit more about how to be more coherent about our lives and think about things in a different way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because when I always think about, and going on from what you're talking about, I always think it's very funny when you look at, the whole Darwin thing, theory that he talks about with evolution and stuff. And I always say, well, you've got to flip that upside down. It's our Indigenous cultures and our dark races that are the ones that had all of that knowledge. It's only as the world's continued, our senses, we used to have, I don't know, what was it, so many senses, including that mind's eye that the mind tapped into. And blackfellas, being the oldest living race, and being most advanced in so many things. We had sign language, we had, we had fire, we had all of that we had proper rituals and things that would be in place and that were in time, played in timelines, that were a part of those certain cultural practices and processes that were done to maintain the land and to maintain our way of life, really. And all of those stories and all of those knowledge, when you look at it from way back then, we are nowhere near where any of our ancestors were. Our minds are way too closed for that at the moment. Some of us, are very much open to it, which is why some of us can go on to different levels, can be much more in that spiritual to the physical, what I talk about a lot. But, you know, it's that astral travelling, all of that sort of stuff, understanding and being able to talk to someone else with your mind. You know, like I can look at another blackfella and give them a bit of sign language and they know exactly what I'm talking about, you know, without saying 2 words. And these are all these sort of things, but those knowledges and those cultural practices have been going on for years. And it's only now that this generations, you know, this world that we're living in, I don't know what world it is, it's a very Western world, but I don't know what you actually call it. There's got to be another word other than just a Western world. But I feel like this world that we're in, we're very much at a standpoint of not being, you know, I feel like we've blurred the lines too much for our minds to tap back into it so easily, you know, so we've got to go through all of our, you know, challenges that our mind goes through in order to be able to tackle it and then reach to that section of that higher sensory. Like, you know, there's a thing when it comes to meditation, it's very important. Every culture has meditation and, you know, the idea of going back into, you know, a deep thinking and just being one with the self and where you are, you know, and what you're one with, what's around you. And, you know, blackfella's been doing that for years.
When you
talk those sort of things is what I'm talking about. And, you know, we talk about the dreaming being something of the past, and it's not something of the past, it's happening right now. You guys are all a part of my dreaming, you know, like we're all part of Uncle's dreaming. You are your own dreaming in a way. Like here in our culture, our dreaming continues. It's not something that's a past, you know, we've got to document what's happening now for our future generations. You know, what's being documented now is what our ancestors documented way back then, you know, for us to know what we know now. So what are we documenting now for that future generation to understand? And we're documenting the modern world, you know, we're documenting and adapting, like Uncle's saying, we need to use these modern technologies. You know, our culture has been adapting for over millions of years, thousands of years, you know, and it's one thing that we're good at, that we've always been good at, is adapting. And every time we've adapted though, our way of life hasn't changed. Our morals, our law, and the way we practice our things and we do things hasn't changed in that way. It's changed a little bit because of colonisation, and a lot of it's been lost because of colonisation. But nothing to me is ever truly lost, not if the people are there, you know, and the stories are there.
Yeah.
And that's what I believe, yeah.
It's really powerful to hear, Kat, and it reminds me of something that Lynn said once when I was talking to her. I think, Lynn, you'd been talking with some Dja elders, and it was the first time I really got a sense of translating the word country in the way that Indigenous Australians use it, because your culture and your memory is literally embedded in the landscape and in the stars. If country's taken away, your knowledge is there, right?
Yeah.
And I know, Lynn, you've picked up this idea too. You sort of joke that you can't move house now because you've got so many Lynn's created all these songlines around her house to become senior memory champion.
Means too much now.
But now her knowledge is there in her land.
I've only just glimpsed this. I've only been doing it for about 6 years, and I've got about 10 kilometres. I know it's trivial on Indigenous, but 10 kilometres around Castlemaine, where I've embedded history and every country in the world and all of history and everything, and a lot of characters. So if I just walked down to the shops, all these characters from time try to talk to me, and sometimes I just have to turn them off and say, I'm just going shopping. Except St. Augustine, he will not shut up. He comes out from his lamppost every time. My landscape has become alive with information.
Amazing.
And if you name any country or any time in history, I will go just instantly to that, in my mind, to that location. And I am so emotionally attached. If my house burns down, I'll grab the husband and I'll grab that. Then I'll grab these two. Then I'll worry about things that might be worth something because I have such an emotional investment. And that's what I hadn't understood. So if you now imagine 10,000, 20,000, 60,000 years of emotional attachment to that landscape and intellectual attachment to the landscape, and then someone comes along and whacks a fence across and shoots you if you go there, which is your encyclopedia, which is your emotional, spiritual, everything. The physical cruelty is one thing, the intellectual cruelty is horrific. And in America, the reason I work with Pueblo people in America, they weren't moved off their land in New Mexico, but all the others were to reservations and told, well, the land's better for farming, what are you grizzling about? And they called it the Walks of Tears because they were walked off country of everything that mattered to them. And I get quite upset.
Yeah,
So that, yeah.
about that.
When
Sorry,
the word
I've
country
read
is
about
used, I can't feel it as an Indigenous Australian would feel it, but I start to get some glimpse of what it must mean. It's a glimpse. Yeah. There's something else I wanted to pick up on, Kat, when you were talking. You were talking about the way in which the stories allow you to predict, what for farming or for when particular eggs are going to be laid or whatever. This is something that Dwayne's picked up on in his work as well, is the role of stories and the knowledge in the stars to predict events. Yeah, and this is such an important part of how we adapt and survive, is being able to predict the future and know what to do next. Do you want to speak to some of the cues? Because from what I understand from your work, it has to do with noticing small changes in the brightness of stars at certain times of the year or at certain times of the evening. The scintillation that I punned before that no one got, but when they're getting to scintillation. And the colours, and this is where Simon, I think, because Simon's expertise is colour perception, how colour and scintillation provide these subtle cues to predict the future. Yeah.
So I spoke before about how the elders have taught me and continue teaching me how to read the stars. I pick a lot of this up in the Torres Strait, where I'm going on Saturday, incidentally. I learned from the elders up on Mare, which is Murray Island, home of Eddie Mabo, of course. And some things that I've learned over the years, which was kind of funny, when I studied astrophysics, we learned about the Hertzsprung-Russell Diagram. This is the way that astronomers have classified stars based on their temperature and their luminosity. So basically the color at the foundation tells you about the different types of stars, where their peak emissions in their black body, where they are in their evolutionary process based on mass and density and blah blah physics. But when I started learning about some of the different ways Aboriginal cultures classified stars, it's very similar. And I found it quite interesting. The Luritja people in the Central Deserts, who border the Aranda near Alice, they have a classification system based on color. There's Tataka and there's Jokera. Jokera are the whitest stars and Tataka are the redder stars. When you're outside, and I'm sure Simon can talk about this, you're outside and you start getting dark eye adaptation, you really lose color perception. Your cone's basically shut down and you're only left with your rods. But when there's just enough color, you basically sense sort of red color and white. So what the people had noticed is that some of the stars, the Joker, were very whitish. Some of them were Tataka, they were red. Some of them were a bit reddish white, sort of yellow, orange color. Those would be the Tataka Jokera. And then you had the really red stars, the Tataka Endora. Those would be like Antares, Betelgeuse, Aldebaran, Gamma Crucis. And I found that quite interesting. So you got different classifications of the stars based on their color, but also their relative position to each other. Certain groups of stars are very effective for different types of things. So, for example, long linear constellations are really good for navigation. If it's a group of stars, when you twist around, looks pretty much the same, that's not going to really be that useful. But I saw, even here in Victoria, like the Western constellation Hydra is a very long constellation. It's the largest of the 88 Western constellations, incidentally. That Scorpius, sort of long linear constellations, as they turn, they're very noticeable. You can tell how they orient. And those were used for navigation, which I thought was also quite fascinating. Changes in the properties of the stars, so changes in their brightness, for example. So in the Torres Strait, the elders tell me that they observe the way the stars scintillate, the way they twinkle. Because if you know how to read the different properties of the stars and how they twinkle, you can predict seasonal change, you can predict weather, you can predict wind, you can predict trade winds. And when the elders started going into detail about this, I initially was sort of shocked. I didn't know anything about this. 10 years of studying astrophysics, I had heard nothing about this sort of stuff. It showed me how limited my Western education was. But as the elders began talking about it, they say, well, for example, you look at stars. When stars twinkle, that indicates wind. But you don't just look at any star. You look at the bright stars that are, they said, the top stars, the ones that are high above. Because if you look at stars lower on the horizon, they're more susceptible to scintillation. From an astrophysics perspective, I understood, because you're looking through a thicker layer of the Earth's atmosphere. When you look at those stars high above, you look at the really bright ones. You don't look at the faint ones. The faint ones are more susceptible to scintillation. The bright ones are less. So if you see the bright ones twinkling, you know that there's rapid wind. But it's not just the fact that they're twinkling. It's, do they appear sharp or do they appear fuzzy? Do they appear to change color? And this was one that really surprised me, because the elder was telling me, he passed away a couple years ago, unfortunately. He was only 56. Not an uncommon occurrence, as it seems. He was telling me, well, you look at those top bright stars, how they're twinkling. For example, if they change from this color to this color, it means this, and from this color to this color, it means that. And he said, if you look at the stars, and they're high above, and they're twinkling very rapidly, they're a little bit fuzzy, and they appear very blue. That means a storm is imminent. And here I am trying to unpack this, thinking, okay, what does this mean? And then it dawned on me that, okay, scintillation references wind, so the storm from the wind, if the stars appear very fuzzy, that means there's a lot of humidity in the atmosphere. It's making the sharpness degrade a bit. But what's this business about blue? Why would they appear blue? And it took me a little bit of time to realize what it was. Water absorbs red and green wavelengths of light. Water is very poor at absorbing blue wavelengths of light. Therefore, if there's a lot of humidity in the atmosphere, the starlight coming through, the humidity is absorbing the red and green wavelengths of light, only the blue light is coming through. Blue is not a color you see at night very well, but I do remember being outside on a few occasions and seeing the moon appearing very blue and being amazed by it, and it was pouring down rain the next day. So the elders are telling me about the conceptual physics behind what's going on. They never said it was the physics, but this is what they're talking about. And it's something that I had not really seen recorded or discussed anywhere, even in my field of cultural astronomy. I hadn't really read anything about that. And I went to a conference in Hawaii, and I asked, there's a guy there, he's doing a PhD on northern Dene, Athabascan astronomy. This is Arctic, Alaska, and Canada. Yeah. And I said, what about this whole thing about twinkling stars? He's like, oh, we have tons of that up there. Really? Oh, yes. And he went on talking about the others. And it was all kind of the exact same base information, but applied to that inland Arctic environment instead of an island tropical environment. But it was still the same basic things. It was so cool to see how that was applied in that context.
It's really interesting that Kat was talking about the integration. One of the stories I learned from, not directly, from the Cullen people of New Guinea is they'll take the star, they'll measure the calendar as the stars are moving along the mountain range, which gives them a calendar like we use. But to plant the taro, they won't just use that. They use the scintillation of behaviour of the stars and the arrival of the rainbow bee-eater, because the rainbow bee-eater bird is migratory and it comes in up high, and when it detects moisture, will move down low. So they use the calendar to be ready, the stars to get another indication, and the bee-eater behaviour, boom, we plant. And it's a much more accurate way of judging, but it's that integration that Kat was talking about, that it's not either astronomy or animal behaviour, it's integrated.
All interconnected. And it's like an energy in a way, and everything just sort of, that energy affects everything, to even how we are as people, and everything, and how we react to that environment that we're in that time, in that moment.
I think it's I hate to cut the conversation off because in some ways I feel like we're just getting going, but we've only got a few minutes left and I wanted to leave some time for people to ask questions if they'd like to of our panel. We've got about 10 minutes for questions and there's a roaming mic. Has anyone got a question for any of the panellists? Over here.
That was great, thank you. I've learned so much from the three of you today.
When the surface twinkle indicates changing from the wet to the dry, or dry to the wet.
Hi, I don't remember your name. Is it Lynn?
Lynn, yeah.
Lynn, hi, Lynn. I wanted to know if you could just give us an example of, you mentioned using that block of wood to learn information about hundreds of birds, and I'm wondering if you can give an example of how that works, because that's something that fascinates me, and meeting from the Western
into
world.
an exam, couldn't you? They haven't got
Yes.
a list
Yeah.
of things to take out
That's
of
a
the
good
exam.
point.
And you take it in your mind. Cultures use jewellery and all sorts of things. I talked about these in the memory code, and I'd say 50%. I did Stonehenge, Let's Solve World Mysteries. About 5% of the emails I get are about archaeology. The other 95 are about the memory methods, and this gets everyone in. How do you use it? It'll just work. I know it's hard. So let's start. The first bird is the emu. It's Dromaeidae. They're all a day, id, if you're going to be really fanatical. So you don't need to remember that. So drum roll, we'll start with the emu. There was a little bead there, but it's fallen off because I'm bad at craft. But it left a little sharp, pricky thing, which works because I can sing all the families. There's tactile dance. So that's the emu. I only need one. Here's the next one is the ducks. So there's a little speck on there that, in my imagination, is a ducktail wagging. And there's another little speck which is a gnat. So they're a gnatidae. And then I make a story of the 16 ducks. The first one is the Magpie Goose. Fair bit in, few in, we've got the swan. So it's a story of a footy match between the magpies and the swans, which gets extremely violent. Got to have violence in there. There's sex as well, I'll get to that. So the Australasian shoveler is burying all the dead. The hardhead's belting them up, which is why we've got blue-winged ducks and pink-eared ducks. The musk duck is off, there's the sex bit. Musk duck. So that story gives me the list of them in order, and then, as Kat was saying, I'll layer. So I'll add to that story more and more and more. They're brothers if they're the same genus, and so on. And so there's 82 families, and then stories for the big families. Most of them only have one or two birds in. If you do it, that one, see where the dribble is? That's Menuridae, the lyrebird, because a man's urinated down the side of my Lucasa, which was a bit rude of him, and lyrebird, he lied about it. You will always get a story, and your brain will have no trouble extracting what's true and what's the story. And that's why the question, are the ancestors biological ancestors or mythological, is a stupid question, because it doesn't matter. That's not of consequence. Is the story true or not is also not an answerable question, because it's a mesh of a whole lot of things. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I like that idea about curriculum and assessment. Is there any reason we couldn't allow students to come in and take exams by using a memory device? No. I'm going to try that.
There's some schools that are using their main exam room and setting it up as a memory palace. Yeah. So, for example, for visual arts in year 11 and 12, there's 20 elements and principles and elements. So if you've got those 20 around the room and you want to address them in an essay, you just go, phew, and you've got the complete list there. Yeah. And you can layer. A songline doesn't have, once we put the visual elements in, we can't do anything else. I've got 5 things, different, completely unrelated things in my main songline. You can layer and layer and layer. Schools are starting to do that, use these sorts of devices. You've even started using your hands. Start looking at them. There's so many specks and dots and wiggles. And so, yes, schools are starting to do it.
Fantastic. Any more questions from the audience? There's a question down here, Kat.
It's all been so fascinating and amazing and quite emotional to listen to, so thank you, everyone. I'm kind of interested in learning from culture rather than about. I think as mental illness is still rising with all the knowledge we have from science. Simon, what do you think we can learn about, all of this in relation to perhaps psychosis, mental illness, which can sometimes perhaps be caused from a lack of connection to each other, to land, to culture? I know that's a very broad kind of question, but anything you can reveal would be wonderful.
I think you almost answered it as well. It is that lack of coherence and connection, which then does have the knock-on effect of perhaps making us feel more alone, which then is not a particularly healthy place to be in. And there's certainly some evidence that in more connected culture, there is less sense of alienation in somebody who is experiencing a different version of the world. I really don't like the term mental illness at all. I don't think it helps. Because they feel supported. So they're actually looked after, they're fed and they're cared for, and there are people there to help them. So one of the worst things I think that people feel when they might be feeling something that is sufficiently far away from the norm for them to find it hard to generally interact with everyone else all the time, so they end up feeling quite isolated and perhaps not great, is they start to feel more alone and alienated and different. And that then changes the way that they behave in the context of everybody else, which just exacerbates the situation. Having, in a sense, more common ground with everyone that doesn't change, so like the night sky or the land around you, gives you that sense of connection with everyone, however you're feeling, which I think potentially puts people in a better place to maybe just say, I could do with a bit of help, or for other people to notice that they could do with a bit of help and look after them more readily. We live in our houses with our walls and gardens that have walls, and spend a lot of time communicating with people who you'll never meet. And it's not a particularly healthy place to be a lot of the time. And so we've lost something, the connection and the sort of coherence of ourselves with our environment and with everyone else. And I think that doesn't set us up to do well when we're not coping as well as we might do.
And with our ancestors, I realised I didn't have ancestors, because ancestors, or whatever they are in different cultures, you learn from the stories they tell, is the expression I kept getting. And I realised from my grandparents, I know who they were and what they did, and that's about it. So I have constructed my own set of ancestors. That's why St. Augustine keeps annoying me. And it's not because I'm Catholic. He was really into memory palaces and things and wrote some beautiful stuff about it. But I have had to create a set of people from the past who I can interact with mentally and learn from, and that's enriched my life massively. And I think we've lost that, which...
and just going back to that and going back to the mental health thing, we also talk about in our way is when you do feel like that disconnection and you do feel a loss, we always talk about going back and grounding yourself. And, whether that's, I always see fire as a masculine, energy or a masculine element. I always see water as a more female, fluid element. So I'm always drawn to water, when I go healing and I feel like I can't go anywhere. When I moved, I lived in the city for 15 years, and I've served this community for 15 years. And only now, where my spirit had felt like it was so detached, I missed that many funerals back home. I missed a lot of changes that were happening to the landscape. We've got the roads going up home, up to Garryword there, Jabberung, Mobber, fighting at the moment with the trees and the highway at the moment. We've got that coming up to us next. That's going to be our fight. So there's things there, there's expectations that are cultural expectations that I need to be strong spiritually to be able to go up and to deal with that sort of stuff, those sort of things, And I was at this point where being in the city was keeping me from that. Unfortunately, being in the city was making me isolated. It was messing with my mental health big time. And it wasn't until Mum had said, come home, babe, you know, we're going to go swimming, you're going to go swimming in the river, you're going to just let your feet be grounded in the earth, not wearing anything to, you know, because your feet are your main central points too of feeling anything. They're your first things to touch anything. And so, you know, do that, and then we'll have a smoking, you know, and you can burn your feet a little bit in the coals, you know, and just cleanse. And that's my ritual, but that's grounding me, and that's taking me back to where I was able to come back to the city and go, okay, where am I going in my life? Have I done all that I needed to do? And I was working at Acme. You know, Acme is very big. I'm a curator at Acme. I just finished with their production of the redevelopment, which is going to stand for the next 10 years. But I walked away from that job. You know, I could have stayed there if I wanted to. But my culture and my people and that connection is more stronger and more important to me rather than where my career is going to be. You know, there was more to life rather than just going and doing, even though that's what my elders wanted me to do too. That's the thing, they send you off, they go be what you want to be and go do what you want to do because you have no limits, you know, and only you can stop yourself, but then bring that back home. Always remember to bring that back home. And some of us forget that. Some of us forget to go back home. Some of us actually can't go back home because of trauma or because of some other personal thing that may be stopping them, but it doesn't mean they don't stop being who they are. They don't stop remembering that that's where they're from, that's where their connection is. They're always still going to be connected even if they don't go home. You know, it's just that different, it's just how we do it differently. But that idea is about grounding yourself again, and we always have that way too. So even if you do feel lost, we also have another way around, a resolution in a way to help you find yourself again. You know, and I think that's in understanding ourselves too.
Understanding ourselves is what we were trying to do tonight, and I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you so much, Kat. We didn't quite get to the highways, but we wouldn't have the highways. The short story there is we wouldn't have the highways if we didn't have Indigenous elders guiding those early explorers along their songlines that were represented in the stars, and Dwayne has done work to map those stars onto our highways. And now they're trying to put a highway through the trees in Jar Jar Wurrung Country. The irony it is shocking, but there you are. Yeah. All comes full circle. Thank you so much to our panel tonight. Please join me in thanking the panel. Thank you, Uncle Dave. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Tam, for putting this on. Thank you to the Royal Society. Thank you, everyone. Good night.